and welcome into To Your Health. You know, we've heard just recently that in the Alabama prison system, as of today, there are 627 slots for correctional officers that are sitting unfilled. Well, that means prisoners are not only being not able to be guarded from harming themselves, but nobody can detect if maybe there's a mental problem with a prisoner also. My guest is Commissioner Kimberly Boswell, and you are the Commissioner of the Alabama Department of Mental Health. And you know, when we talk about our prison system here, we always talk about it's overcrowded. Well, probably 80% of the prisoners that are in there can be treated some other way, don't you think?
I do think. We spend a lot of time, and we've spent a lot of time over the last 3.5 years looking at ways to divert people from jail as well as prison. You know, folks wind up in jail, they repeat a crime, they don't get the help they need, and the next thing you know, they're in that pipeline to the prison, and we certainly want to do everything we can to avoid that. And that is a big part of our crisis care initiative. Being able to get to people when they're actually in a behavioral health crisis and intervene with a professional, as opposed to someone calling law enforcement and they wind up getting picked up and going to jail.
Right.
I love what Dr. Bruce Perry says about individuals who are in prison. I was listening to him. He's a great neuroscientist who does a lot of work in that arena, and he wrote a book with Oprah Winfrey called What Happened to You? And so part of that movement is really saying, instead of saying what's wrong with you, which is often what we ask,
yes.
You know, when, especially if folks are headed in a prison pipeline,
right.
The question is really what happened to you. And I heard him say, you know,
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's like everybody in prison has the same diagnosis. And I sat up in my chair and I thought, well, I can't wait to hear this. And he said, yeah, everybody's diagnosis is, what did you think would happen? And so when we look at people in prison, oftentimes it didn't start with the crime they committed. It started long ago with child abuse, with trauma, with exposure to violence, and a lot of other things that happened along the way that got them to that point to where they committed a crime because they're in a constant state of fight or flight, because they've lived their whole life around violence and trauma, and there's no way for them to resolve that. And so we talk a lot about what are the places along the way that we can stop them from heading down that road into that pipeline in prison. We also do a lot of work with pardons and parole with folks coming out. Because
that's key.
Yes.
That's key.
Statutorily, unfortunately, we don't provide the mental health services in prison, so we can't do a lot while they're there. But when they're coming out, we are working very closely with the Department of Pardons and Parole to work with individuals who are going into their day reporting centers and providing mental health treatment and substance use treatment in those day reporting centers, so that then once they're out in the community, they've had the treatment that they need and they can go out and get a job and become more productive citizens. We get very concerned about the substance use issue in prisons as well.
Yes.
And so we've been in some discussions with Department of Corrections about how we can work collaboratively to address that issue.
So you can work kind of side by side with them, but you can't.
Right.
You can't cross the. You can't go and come inside the fence to be able to do anything, which is sad.
Yeah.
Because that's where they really need to start to have the help.
Well, and Department of Corrections just this past week, they do provide a significant amount of mental health treatment in prisons.
Good.
And they've really stepped up what they're doing in the prison system in terms of treatment while folks are there. They've also done a really fantastic job. You know, this is not what gets the headlines, but we spent earlier in the week time looking at the job placement program that they have there. And really, we often say in our world, you know, the best treatment for mental illness is a job.
Absolutely.
Because if people can feel productive and they can get a paycheck. And so there's a lot that they're doing on that side as well to train individuals in commercial driver's license, welding, plumbing, electrical. Unfortunately, that's just not what we hear a lot about these days.
That's a shame.
And so there are a lot of things going on to really try and get folks into recovery when they're coming out of prison, and then also get them into rehabilitation and a good job. The story earlier in the week was about a guy who left and started his first job making $85,000 as a welder.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then again, it's self-worth.
Right.
Such a key point. You have to feel that of worth, that you're worthy of something.
Right, exactly.
Which is really great. Now, they talk about when they wanted to defund police, and they said, well, how about rather than sending a police, let's send a social worker out there. That might be a little tough when it's a real violent situation. Are police officers trained to be able to look at a situation to determine if it's mental health and try to address it differently than just going in saying this is a crazy, well, I say crazy, but this is a person that's beside themselves and shoot the person?
We do have some training around the state. You know, crisis intervention team training is something that we initiated several years ago. And last year, we really put additional funding into that. We have a wonderful advocate named Johnny Hollingsworth. The National Alliance for Mentally Ill Alabama chapter is the organization that is implementing that program. And Johnny has trained many, many law enforcement agencies across the state. There are many more who are interested in that training. And it basically teaches the officer to know, to be able to go into that situation.
Assess the situation.
Right, because often the same tactics that law enforcement officers use escalate a mental health condition. You know, they're trained to be pretty forceful in that situation, but if you go in there and it's really a mental health issue, that same kind of training really only escalates the crisis for that individual. And so a lot of it is about teaching officers how to de-escalate that situation and to know when it's looking like it's a mental health issue.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. We're going to get you to come back again next week. We want to talk about a couple of other factors. Mental health is not this big, it's this big. So, and there's information about their department on the line. And remember, reach out whenever you feel that there's a need, because the best way to do it is to get help. We'll be right back right after this.